Welcome into the Living Room Disciple podcast. Today I'm so blessed to be joined by Karen Swallow Pryor, the author of the Evangelical Imagination. Now here on the Living Room Disciple, our goal is to look around at the world and at our lives and ask the question, is this forming me to be more or less like Jesus? But Dr. Pryor's book helped me realize that if we aren't careful, we can actually begin treating discipleship as just another method of self-help. This has been a huge shift in perspective for me, and I am so excited to share my conversation with Dr. Pryor. Now, as always, you can support the Living Room Disciple on Patreon by visiting livingroomdisciple.com. And with that, let's jump into the episode on the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home. All right, we are here with the one and only Karen Swallow Pryor. Dr. Pryor, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's a beautiful fall day. I'm just loving
it. I love it. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself for somebody that doesn't know who you are?
Sure. I am a writer. I am a reader, and I have been an English professor for several decades in evangelical settings. And now I'm just pursuing writing full time along with speaking and doing a lot of podcasts. So,
yeah. Well, we are grateful for that and so grateful to have you with us today because my mind was blown by your most recent book, The Evangelical Imagination. Just so many layers to unpack, and we're really only going to focus on one chapter primarily today in this conversation. So before we even start, I just want to tell all of our listeners, go buy this book because every single chapter is just so crucial, so important, and so rich. So thank you for the time and the years and the effort that it took to put into that book and even to develop your imagination to have the ideas for the book. But we were talking before we started recording today, and really there's rarely been a book that fits the overall topic of what this podcast exists for in the first place. So I'm so grateful to have you on today. So tell us a little bit about what the book is about from kind of a 30,000 foot view, what your idea was behind writing it and what your goal is.
Yeah, so it's called the Evangelical Imagination, which suggests some things that, aren't what the book is about. I do talk about the individual imagination, a lot of works of imagination, but I really focus in on what's called the social imaginary, which is our collective pool of stories, images, metaphors, legends, myths, expectations of how things should go. I'm obviously drawing on the ideas of Charles Taylor and others who talk about this this communal pool of stories that we have. And of course, I'm talking about the community of evangelicals. And I give sort of a brief history of this 300-year-old moment, some of the definitions that scholars go by because everyone likes to contest what the word means today. And that's just sort of the foundation. And then I identify a number of what I think are some of the key images and metaphors within this evangelical social imaginary, and each chapter is centered on those.
All right. So you're using the word imagination a little bit different than the way we usually think about the word imagination, whether it's like fantasy or imaginations of children or things like that. So can you define that word imagination the way you're using it?
Yeah. So when I'm I do give sort of the etymology and the foundation of the word. I mean, it literally, if you think about it in this most literal sense, the imagination is the ability of our mind to make an image. And as Christians, we know that we're made in the image of God. So it's like his mind imagined us and made us. And since we're made in his image, we also are little image makers. And so that is, that is what we are doing when we use our imaginations. But it's so much more than what we tend to think of, because if I'm thinking about a conversation I'm going to have later today, that's using my imagination. If I am doing math problems, which I don't or try not to, math is imaginary in the truest sense of the word. So you're using your imagination when you're working out a math problem. We're using our imagination when we're knitting together all of the understanding that we might have, even when we're using reason and rational thinking. It depends on using our imagination. And so I talk about that a little bit and then make that connection to our collective imaginations called our social imaginary. And so hopefully it helps people to think to imagine a little bit differently about the imagination, because I
Yeah.
argue it's really the imagination is the most powerful part of what it means to be human, and it drives everything that we do. So I want people to think about that more, and then to think about how we imagine together for good or ill,
Yeah.
because, it can work out for us, and we can also make a lot of mistakes along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think we can be especially guilty, especially in evangelical camps that are really focused on things like good doctrine, which is a good thing, but we can get so kind of scientific and facts based around things that we forget that we are all influenced by this collection of pictures and stories and narratives that are collected in our heads and shaping us on a day to day basis. That is so much more powerful than a set of any facts could be. So you had this
Right.
quote early on in the book where you said that your goal was to tease out the elements of the evangelical social imaginary in such a way that those elements that are truly Christian can be better distinguished from those that are merely cultural. And so on this podcast, we told you a little bit, our goal is to be formed by what is truly Christian, because our goal is to look around us and see the things that are forming us and ask, is this forming me to be more like Jesus, or is it forming me to be less like Jesus? And to our surprise, we've begun to realize that things that we assumed were Christian and were forming us to be like Jesus actually are cultural and are things that we've adopted from the outside world. And so one of those that really struck me in your book, you talked about the invention of improvement. And I've just always assumed that people want to get better, that we want to make a better society, that we want to make ourselves better, that we want to make our conditions better, that we want to improve our social class or our level of wealth or things like that. That's just a basic assumption that I have. But I realize now that that is an assumption I have because of my imagination that has been given to me, right? So can you
Right.
talk a little bit about the invention of improvement?
Oh, I love this topic. And I have, of all the podcasts I've done, a few may have mentioned this chapter, but nobody really just wanted to sit down and talk about this
Oh, we're going all
concept.
in.
So, yeah, all right. No, I'm so excited. So first, let me ask you all listening to use your imaginations for a minute and just think. It's not even that hard, but just because we all know this. So just imagine what it was like to be a human being who lived, just 500 or 1,000 years ago. And the way that you would live then would be the way that your parents lived, and your grandparents, and your great grandparents, and your great great grandparents. I mean, for generation upon generation, for most of human civilization, very little changed. If you were one of the very, very few born to some royal family, that would go on for generation upon generation. And then the rest of the people were farmers or shepherds or whatever for thousands of years. And so if nothing really changed, well, why would you even be thinking about improvement, right? You're just thinking about, providing for your family, being safe, being secure, handing down your beliefs and your traditions. Maybe once in a while, a little improvement comes along or something, but it's just simply not part of the social imaginary. You're not going to have upward social mobility. You're not going to replace your smartphone X with the smartphone 12 or whatever. You're just not even thinking about that. And so in the chapter on improvement, I begin, because evangelicalism is very much a movement of early modernity, right? It's modern. And we think about improvement largely because we're modern, because improvement is an idea of the modern age. And it developed, even the word itself comes from English, and it had to do originally with improving land, like improving its value and its productivity. And it occurred at a time when such improvements could be made. Again, they weren't really made for thousands of years, but with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, that's when any kind of improvements became more possible and more part of the imagination. And so it started with land holdings, and then eventually the word kind of evolved to mean any kind of improvement. By the time we get to the Victorian age, everyone's all about improvement of everything, including self improvement.
Right. Yeah, so I appreciate that history, and it's really helpful knowing kind of what our roots are. But what are some ways in our day and age that you've seen improvement mentality kind of, I would say, creep into the church, but honestly, totally shape the way we think about Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I think once your mind starts thinking about it, everyone who's listening, you could immediately start thinking about things. I mean, if we start, in the present moment and kind of go backwards, in the present moment, we have all, and again, what I'm talking about isn't just within the church, it's in the culture, but it's so hard to distinguish between the two because the church also, or people in the church may follow like TikTok accounts that give you the latest hack for something. Or, we might buy books that are about self-improvement, being more productive, more successful, more whatever, whatever. Or we might attend a conference that helps us to uh, be more successful in business or be a better leader. Or we might even have a sermon series that has to do with being better at this or that, or improving your marriage, or, again, and it's not to say that any of these things are bad. But when our default assumption is that, bigger is better, newer is improved, that's an assumption that needs to be examined. And
Absolutely.
I'm just touching on a few examples. So there's a lot there, but once you start opening your eyes to that, and then start to think about the difference between, what really needs to change maybe, and grow, which is good, versus just improving to be bigger, better, faster, more up to date, because that never ends, never
Right.
ends. And there are a lot of
Yeah,
people who have
absolutely.
a lot to gain, by making us think that we have to
Mm,
constantly replace and
interesting.
improve.
Keeping
Hmm.
us as hamsters on the wheel.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about how kind of the idea of improvement started at with a simple thing like land, and that makes sense almost technologically, where we had kind of slow developments over that time, whether it was with farming equipment or even the printing press and the scientific revolution that you mentioned, and then factories and the industrial age and all of this kind of slow development of new technologies. And now we have like you graduate college and you don't understand the technology you studied 10 years later. So it's wild how quickly things are developing now. So it's no wonder that improvement is such a basic assumption for us, where it was creeping in 500 years ago, but now it's the air that we breathe. Everything is
Right.
constantly new and
Right.
improved, and continually improving and asking us to improve. But I can imagine somebody's listening to this and they're saying, well, why shouldn't I want to improve? After all, the Bible says that I should be conformed to the image of the Son. What is that but improving? What is discipleship but constant improvement to be more like Jesus, right? And so, what would you say
Right.
that is the difference between improvement and discipleship?
Hmm. That's such a good question. And I will candidly admit that at some point this can come down to just semantics, right? It can just
Mm,
be like, well, we could say it's discipleship and growth, and it's still a kind of improvement, to be sure. But again, words carry weight and baggage and meaning, and so and the distinctions between words are important. So we are supposed to, increasingly conform to the image of Christ. We are supposed to be increasingly sanctified. We are supposed to
hmm
mature and grow and become more like Christ. And all of those things are our call. And we could say that they're forms of improvement. But again, even if we're going to say that, we have to keep in mind what the improvement looks like. But we live in a culture that does improve just for improvement's sake. And the packaging on a product, it could be just the package that has changed, and we buy into that idea that it's better just because it's more appealing to us. I mean, that's just basic human psychology. um I do want to go back for a minute. This isn't even something that I cover in the book. I might allude to it, but I want to go back to, a little bit in history, to the 18th century, some of my favorite writers in that time. And there was an ongoing debate in the 18th century, one that one of my favorite writers, Jonathan Swift, engaged in deeply. He's known as author of the greatest satire in the English language, A Modest Proposal, but a lot of people don't know that he was a devout Anglican clergyman as well. So a lot of his writings deal with what was at that time called the debate between the ancients and the moderns.
Mm.
Because of the scientific revolution and all of the actual improvements that were being made in technology and science and knowledge, and it was marvelous, it was amazing, and they were great improvements. But people of the early modern era began to think that human beings could improve as well, that the human condition could improve, that
Mm.
human beings could progress and be better than the ancient peoples. And this was an ongoing debate. And Swift was, I mean, his satire and his brilliance is rooted in his ability to discern as kind of a priest and a prophet and a poet that the human condition doesn't change. Human beings don't change. We can improve our technology. We can improve our iPhones. Well, he wasn't talking about iPhone. We can improve
Yeah.
our telescopes and microscopes and all those things. But the human soul, the human condition doesn't change. And Swift was trying to, dispel the illusion that many of his peers had that human beings could change. And so that debate was really, important then. And I think even since then, it's just slipped it. We have failed to distinguish between the improvements we might make in our television sets with higher resolution, whatever, right? Great. But we can make the mistake, as Swift saw in the 18th century, to think that we can improve our own condition as human beings. And the only way that we can do that, we know this is as Christians, that's not something that we do collectively or socially. It's something that we do through the power of the Holy Spirit. It's a supernatural grace that allows us to improve and conform to His image, and that's very different from improvement as is understood in the scientific and technological realm.
Yeah, absolutely. So as somebody, to dive a little further deeply into that, as somebody clicks play on this podcast or cracks open the spine of your book, and they're thinking to themselves, I'm going to learn something new. I'm going to improve myself by growing my knowledge or by learning a new hack for how to think about things or how to do things. How should we be thinking about the way that is in our imagination versus just something that we take for granted as something that we should obviously be doing?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So again, part of it, I am a word person, so part of it is thinking about not just the meaning of the word improvement, but the connotations
Mm.
that come along with it, and the sort of expectations that we might have if we're using that word improvement, um, versus. And I know this will resonate with you, versus something like formation,
Hmm.
right? Which formation, we want to be formed and conform to Christ. Formation is kind of like taking some of the same material and reshaping it, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and so we're human beings, we're human souls. If we're Christians, we've been born again, we're new creatures. We're just the blob that can be formed, into likeness of Christ, or be formed to look more like the culture.
Hmm.
And so we're not really changing the materials, I guess, but we are
Interesting.
growing in conformity. This is all, and one of the points I make early in the book and throughout is the reminder that all language is metaphorical, right? And
Hmm.
so all language it's a sign pointing to an idea. And so if every word is a sign, then it can point to the same thing or point to a similar thing, but it is a sign. And so the words that we use matter because they come, with the baggage or with the history. Um, and so when we read good books or we read the Bible, we participate in good art, create good art. That's actually forming us. It's not.
Hmm.
It's a slow process that takes place over time. It's not as though you can. I mean, I guess some people would say I've read a few of these books, but I've just never read one of the books that said how to do something better, and I never was able to really do it better just from reading the book.
Right.
It might give me an idea, but I have to actually embody and practice and habituate myself to that thing. So it's not like a magic solution. Um, but again, it's solving a specific problem. It's not making us better overall as human beings or Christians. It's just, we can solve a problem, but that isn't going
Right.
to make us better.
Yeah, I think that's a great distinction because so much of the Christian life is learning to slow down, learning to be patient, learning to slow down enough to observe God's work in his creation and his
Mhm.
image being showing up in the people around you, even the people you don't like. Is it's slowing down to observe these things. And so
Mhm.
when we're in this kind of life hack improvement culture, it's hard to be formed to look like Jesus, who was willing always to be interrupted to help somebody in need.
Hmm.
Versus
Hmm.
just looking for the next life hack. And if anybody had a life hack, like he could snap his fingers or say a word and heal somebody in the next town over. But
And he
he
did a couple of those
consistently,
things,
yeah,
right? He did some.
that's exactly right. Yes, but he also often takes time to sit and converse and see a person in their needs. And so I think that's a good distinction, that formation is slower than improvement. Although there's also this element of new creation that you talk about, of a complete 180 revolution. In your conversion chapter, I think you talked a lot about that. How Christians have often thought more about an immediate conversion versus a slow process of improvement. So there might be a little bit of nuance there. But I was actually just yesterday listening to the Holy Post interviewed Sky about his new book about heaven. And they were talking about how so often the conversation about heaven has talked about how the earth is going to be utterly, completely destroyed, and then Christians will live on in heaven forever. And what they were trying to redirect us into is this idea that the earth will be remade and become whole, that what is burned away is what is not fit for the eternal kingdom. But the fact is that the earth isn't being destroyed. Like you said, it's kind of a blob that's being rearranged to become what God has in mind. So I think the same thing is true for humans as is true for the cosmos, the universe, the world. That God has a way of taking what is broken and shifting it and renewing it, whether that's in the blink of an eye or whether that's the slow, patient work of learning to look like Jesus. So I think there's a lot to think about there. There's a lot to chew on there. And I think ultimately, as we're asking the question, what does it look like to be like Jesus? We need to ask what are the things that define Jesus? What's the telos? What's the end goal of looking like Jesus that looks different than the telos or the end goal of improvement? And so a big chunk of your chapter on improvement talked about how improvement leads us to either appear or become more wealthy or a higher class. And one of the examples that you gave that struck me was even the way we think about having manners or etiquette um, wasn't originally something that most people would have thought about. It was, you said the word courtesy comes from the fact that it was practiced by the court. And so can you talk about the popularization of manners and etiquette?
Hmm. Yeah, I love this question. No one's asked me about this. That was one of my nerdier parts of the book, and I'm so
Yeah.
excited that it interested you. Yeah, so again, in ancient times, people, if you a small percentage of people would be of royalty and around the court, and everyone else was just sort of peasants or serfs off in the fields, and there was no reason for someone who wasn't part of the court to know the manners and the rules of the court. And until the rise of sort of the middle class, which began in the late medieval period, and then of course escalated through the modern age, and especially the 18th and 19th centuries. And so when social mobility became a possibility, or when interaction between the trading and mercantile class and the court became possible, then it all of a sudden, oh, I need to learn how to conduct myself in the presence of the court. But then that eventually, especially in the Victorian age, almost became a reversal, where when the middle class became dominant, you could make yourself feel like you were like the upper class by learning their manners, learning, to be like them, to speak like them, talk like that. I didn't mention this, but Pygmalion, the film based on George Bernard Shaw's um, Oh, My Fair Lady is the film and Pygmalion is the play. It's all about that. It's all about teaching a poor working street girl how to act like she's upper class. Same with the film with Julia Roberts in it, and what is that, Pretty Lady or Pretty Woman, I
Yeah,
guess. Yeah.
Pretty Woman. Yeah,
Yeah, these stories are told over and over in different ways. Yeah, now and so, but the point is that the whole motivation for learning these manners and these fashions of the upper class is not about being like Christ. It's not
mm,
about being a better human person or Christian. It's about feeling like you have a place in society or respect from society, or can be part of a class that you desire to be part of. And that's a very worldly kind of motivation. And again, I'm not saying, okay, so don't bother to use the proper place settings at the table. I'm not saying that at all, but just that we need to understand what manners are for, what courtesy is for. And rather than it being about making us look better than we are or feel better about ourselves, real manners, real gentility, real courtesy is about making other people feel comfortable. It's
yeah,
about being hospitable to other people. So a simple example about, not chewing with your mouth open. you know, you can do that so that you look like you can, avoid that so that you can look like you're upper class, or you can avoid it so you don't make your neighbor uncomfortable, right? And so there are different
absolutely.
reasons for doing that. Manners should be about the comfort of others, not the appearance of ourselves.
Right. Driven by love your neighbor a lot, not
Yes.
self improvement. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Um, absolutely. I think so. If you talked to my wife, she would tell you that I'm very minimalist, that I don't care much what people think of me or how wealthy I am or anything like that. And yet I still feel this immense pressure to have a nice lawn and to keep my car looking nice and to be wearing clean shoes and to have new clothes every once in a while. And all of these things that are, after reading this chapter on improvement, all of them are to give off the appearance that I'm wealthy, right? That I can afford to buy new shoes, that I can afford to look like people on Instagram and in Hollywood look like. Even that people are paying absurd amounts for new cars just to look like, hey, look, I have a new car. Um, even the desire to keep my lawn mowed, and that can be the same thing, the motivation of I want my neighbors to feel like I'm a good neighbor to them, but it can also be look how nice my house is, right?
Hmm.
And all of this is driven, like I said earlier, by the telos of I want to appear like I belong in this higher class, or I want to appear like I have a good I make a good impression on the wealthy, or like maybe even I am wealthy. And that just seems so different than the end goal of wanting to look like a homeless rabbi who had no place to lay his head and associated with the poor and the outcast. Right. And so if my goal is to look more like the upper class, or like Instagram influencers, or more like a YouTuber, or more like an actor, or a musician, I can try to do all of those things. But if my goal is to look like
Mm.
Jesus, that's going to look revolutionarily different than what we
Yes.
often strive for. Um, and so maybe we need to bring in like an ancient Near Eastern scholar into this conversation too. But I'm so curious how, when the psalmist wrote that blessed is the one who meditates on the law of the Lord day and night, he will be like a tree planted by streams of water. Or when Jesus talks about different ways of what we might now call improvement, how is he thinking about those things? How is the psalmist thinking about those things? How is the apostle Paul thinking about discipleship in ways that would be totally foreign to us simply because we are so formed by just thinking about self-improvement? Um,
Yeah.
so when you think about the biblical authors, and I know that you're not primarily a theologian, but I know you also care about these things. When you think about the Bible, how do you think they may have thought about improvement differently than we do, um,
Mm.
if they even had improvement as a category?
No, I love that question, and I love the psalm that you cited. Is actually, like, I have a little prayer group, and that's the psalm that I have at the
Mm,
header of the group.
cool.
And I do think that metaphor, well, it's literal and metaphor of the tree growing deep roots by the water. I mean,
Yeah.
it's that's it's almost like improvement doesn't even fit that, even though we might call it that.
Right.
It's really growth and stability and maturity, and as a
Yeah,
tree
rootedness.
grow, rootedness, right? And I think of other, of talking about dwelling in the land. I mean, it goes
Wow.
back to that sort of slow, organic growth and living, and that in itself inherently bears fruit,
Mm.
right? So it's, I think the biblical way of understanding improvement is bearing fruit and the kind of fruit that
Wow.
we bear, and it takes a long time to bear fruit.
Yeah.
And so that the metaphor doesn't even work. It's not an improvement to bear fruit. It's actually doing what you were designed to do and giving
Mm.
yourself the time to do it. Whether you are a tree planted by the water, or you are a soul created in the image of God, redeemed in Christ, who is bearing fruit in order to glorify Him in this world and in the next.
Yeah. Now I want to do a deep dive and read the entire Bible and look for all the metaphors I can find, and see how differently the metaphors of Scripture look than the metaphors that we're so used
Mm.
to in our day and age. Metaphors like time is money, which I think was also in your chapter on improvement from Benjamin Franklin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the metaphors that so shape our consumeristic worldview,
Mm-hmm.
and that was one element that jumped out at me, was that when we talk about sanctification, that's primarily a religious activity, whereas when we talk about improvement, that's primarily a consumeristic or
Mm-hmm.
technological way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, what are some ways that we can be formed to be less consumeristic by being aware of our kind of need for improvement?
Hmm. Well, I want to make clear for everyone that I am very much a consumer. I have no,
Yeah.
I have no, um, uh, you know, no claim to pretend otherwise. I think we all struggle with this, but I'm trying to
Hmm.
be more thoughtful about it.
Hmm.
And the one thing that is a truism, I don't know where it comes from, but it's something like, the first half of life is an accumulation, and the second half of life is a shedding.
Wow.
um that I think that's very true, and it's true for all times and places, but especially in a consumeristic age, it takes on resonance. There's nothing more humbling, I think, that anyone that I know of has experienced than moving a home, because
Yeah.
when you do that, you realize how much stuff you have and that you don't need. And again, this is a particularly modern and American phenomenon. It's not something that everyone in every time and place has experienced. But if we can just, again, open our eyes to how much we consume and how much we have that we don't need. And this is where I think is a particular gift of like millennials and Gen Z and Gen Y, because you are moving toward that more minimalistic lifestyle, sometimes out of necessity or because of the possibilities that technology offers. Um, and each generation has its sort of own reasons for being the way that it is. And I think we are becoming more aware of that. I think we are seeing the logical conclusion of an overly consumeristic lifestyle, and so that's why like slow fashion and slow food and those kinds of
Yeah.
things are
Right.
coming more into play. So I think that's a good development. It's still happening within a context where we consume so much, and so maybe if we think more about it's not, we can reduce that impulse, but also we can counter it by creating more, trying to. So,
Mm.
um, even if we have expendable money, for example, if we, in time, we can think about spending that time and money with something like going to an art museum, which
Right.
we're not bringing anything home, but we're forming our minds and we're supporting something that's already there and important. So we can make small decisions that not just cut back on the consumption, but actually add to the creativity of the world. And so, like, there's a
Right.
double effect there. Those are small things, but I think that can be transformative if we start to um, be deliberate in doing those things. And it has it compounds over time.
Yeah. And I think that plays back to what you said at the very beginning of this conversation about how we are images of God coming out of the imagination of God and how he has created us to be creative as well. So to
Right.
create things rather than to consume things. I love that image. Um, and how much would you say that kind of our consumerism and our desire for more and more and more, or our desire to keep up with the Joneses or to improve our status like that, how much of that comes from would you say the moralization of wealth, where I think it was also Benjamin Franklin that you quoted, where he had this passage that I think he wrote in a letter, if I'm remembering correctly,
Mm-hmm.
where he was talking about how there's a class of people who have manners and have etiquette and who live correctly, and then there's another class who are poor and they live in shacks, and so they're dirty and they're morally not
Mm-hmm.
upright like we
Mm-hmm.
are. And there's this moralization of wealth
Mm-hmm.
equals moral versus the poor are
Yes.
inherently immoral. So how much do you think that idea, that imagination that forms us, how much do you think that plays into our desire for accumulation and keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great example of how a social imaginary works. It's there, it's been forming us and shaping us for generations, and we are largely even unaware of it. We might just, encounter it unexpectedly on the side, when we just have an assumption about someone's status based on how they appear. I mean, it's just ingrained in us, and it can affect the way that we live too, but it also can be larger than us. It's very difficult to combat in the sense. So if we think of, I'll just bring up the example of washing machines, because we all need washing machines. And yet, everyone I know who has a washing machine, um, and who's bought one in the past 10 years, it has not lasted a long time. Whereas things, from a generation ago would last for decades. And so it's almost as that, because it's so big, because we live in this culture where it's almost impossible to get something that will last because they're not
Yeah.
made to last. And so it can feel as though, we can hardly fight this, but we can, and it will, we can do this by the choices that we make, and of what we buy and what we don't buy, or and and then thinking about how we think about other people and support these systems or don't. It takes a long time for a social imaginary to change, and
Yeah, no doubt.
yeah, and so this is just the start of it, is to think about it and examine these assumptions that we haven't looked at before.
Yeah, for sure. And my hope and prayer would be that part of the fruit of both your book and this podcast would be that people would learn to look to Jesus as that end goal. Jesus is what morality is. Jesus is
Mhm.
what a human is supposed to be,
Mhm.
rather than any of these other things that creep into our social imaginary and paint a picture and tell a story and force us to live in a way that we're not even aware that we're living.
Mhm.
Um, so one of the things that I walked away from that chapter with was this idea that, is my goal to become the best version of myself, or is my goal to become a new creation in Christ? And I think that really gets to the heart of Christian theology. Can I
Mhm.
save myself by finding enough life hacks and by becoming a good enough person and by having good enough manners and by having nice enough shoes? Or do I need to be made new by somebody outside of myself? Do I need to be reborn? Which obviously, being born is not something that any of us have any control over.
Right.
Um, and so, can you speak to that a little bit? What would you
Mm.
say is the Christian goal when we're thinking about this topic? What is the Christian goal as we seek to look like Jesus?
Hmm. There is a tension there, because I do, because we live in culture because God designed it that way, right? Like he could
Yeah,
have
right,
created us. He could have created us, and and done away with this um earth, and had us just immediately go to the new heaven and earth that we talked about earlier. But we have this way station here in the middle, for whatever reason, where we're not in eternity yet. And so he obviously is part of his plan for us to exist in human time and human culture and human place. And so, and I love culture. I think if you go to another culture across the globe and you meet Christians there, they're going to look like the people in that culture. Just like when people come here,
right.
they're going to look like Americans, and that's okay, to a certain extent. But I think it goes to what you brought up earlier. What is our drive? What is our
Mm,
motivation? How are we using the things that we have available to us in this culture, which are blessings and gifts? Are we using them for ourselves and our self-improvement, or are we using them so that we can live a life that is allows us to become more like Jesus?
right.
That's the question, right? And that's the question we have to ask ourselves, not just once, but probably every day or multiple times a day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a hang up I've had for a long time is, for the last couple of years at least, is as I've been trying to get more to the heart of what Christian faith is, what the Bible is actually talking about, what Jesus actually advocated, versus some of the more cultural things that have influenced me through the years that I learned in church and assumed were biblical, but
Mhm.
were actually cultural additions. As I've tried to get more to the heart of the faith, I've realized that the thing Jesus talks about more than anything is the kingdom of God. And as he talks about the kingdom, he says the kingdom of God has drawn near. And he said that thousands of
Mm.
years ago. So I have this stirring in my heart to go, then why aren't things getting better? And I'd never realized again that that was something that I might bring to the text that Jesus never would have thought about. Um, so
Mhm.
I'm realizing that maybe that's the wrong question. And that led me
Mhm.
to go back and look closer at Jesus and realize that when he talked about improvement, the improvement was from first to last, right? The improvement was
Mhm.
actually downward mobility. Um,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and so,
Yeah. Wow.
first of all, what an immensely challenging thought that is from our Savior, that we're supposed to be
Mm.
running the race backwards in a sense. Um,
Mm.
but I just pray that we are motivated to, like you said, to become more like Jesus. And I think that the Evangelical Imagination, the book that you've written, is a gift to us in doing that, because we can shed away some of the things that are actually Victorian and not Christian, or the things that are actually evangelical and not Christian. Um, and so thank you for the gift of that book.
Okay.
And thank you for your time today. What are you kind of thinking next? What can we be on the lookout for from you moving forward?
Well, I have a couple of books in mind, but I'm a slow
I
book
love it.
writer, so those will be
Yeah.
down the road, but they're in my mind germinating. But in the meantime, I have started a Substack newsletter called The Priory, where I'm actually sort of among other things, I'm going through and teaching my British Literature Survey course, and so we're studying the Canterbury Tales together right now. And see,
Wow.
the newsletter's free, weekly installments, and I always try to make connections between the literature that I love and life as a Christian, life as a human, and just kind of weave all those together. So I would love to see people sign up for my free newsletter at the
Yeah.
Priory.
I love that. Is there anywhere else that we can find you and connect with you online?
You can get sort of a basic overview of all my work at my website, karenswallowprior.com. And I also am embarrassingly on Twitter too much at KS Prior.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And again, to our listeners, I cannot stress enough, you need to get this book. It is incredible and will be such a treasure for you as it was for me. So thank you, Dr. Pryor, for writing it.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for the blessing of this conversation. Well, I hope today's episode has left you with a lot to think about, and for real, I hope it drives you to purchase The Evangelical Imagination by Karen Swallow Prior. Our prayer is that our lives would be aimed at Jesus, not at any cultural vision of what success looks like. So if you want to support us in that mission, you can follow along on social media or visit livingroomdisciple.com to support us on Patreon. As always, we are so grateful that you've taken the time to listen, and we'll see you next time on the Living Room Disciple, where discipleship finds a home.